Hello class, welcome to the virtual session of African Studies AFS 101. Today is the third week or the third lecture for the semester. But before we go into the third lecture, let's take some few minutes and remind ourselves about what we studied last week. Last week we looked at two main things. We looked at the factors that delayed the development of African studies. Then we moved on to discuss some misconceptions that have been told or that are held about Africa and continues to prevail even in contemporary Africa. Regarding the factors that delayed the development of African studies, we noted 4 points. The first point was that some European scholars argued that Africa did not have a history. Neither did Africa contribute to the history of the world. For this reason, it did not have, or Africa could not be studied as an academic discipline because they had not contributed in any way to the history of the world. The second was the role of the Africans themselves. There we highlighted some of the deeds or behaviors of the African people which gave them a bad image both in Africa and outside Africa. And this bad image made Africa seem like a continent not worthy of any academic attention. We also talked about the philosophical arguments, where some early European scholars argued that Africans are an inferior people with an inferior mind, incapable of producing any intellectual knowledge. The last was the work of the missionaries, which is also based on how the missionaries reported Africans to the outside world. They reported Africa or the people in Africa as primitive, barbaric, with religion which is polytheistic in nature. All these things put together delayed the development of African studies. We further indicated that some African scholars, and to some extent some early Europeans as well, offered counter-arguments, which eventually led to the establishment of African studies as an academic discipline, both on the continent of Africa and outside the continent of Africa. We went further to discuss some of the misconceptions about Africa. We said that misconceptions are incorrect views, opinions, or some false information that are portrayed or given about a person or a group of people. With respect to Africa, we studied last week that there are certain misconceptions or certain ideas that have been portrayed. They included the idea that Africa does not have a history. Africans are primitive, barbaric, and that Africa is a continent of crisis, full of corruption, overpopulation, and conflict. We further went on to state that there is also a misconception that Africa is a continent or a race. We further went to state that Africans are inferior people with inferior minds. At the end of the lecture, we indicated that some of these misconceptions are untrue, others are true, but they are not peculiar to the African continent. It is therefore inaccurate for anyone to tag African with such derogatory names. With this said and done, let's move into today's lecture. Today is the third lecture, and today our focus is going to be on the geography and the history of Africa. This is African Studies, and so we are going to introduce you to the continent of Africa. At the end of the lecture, you should be able to define the boundary and then the resources that are found in Africa. you should also be able to recount the activities of Africans prior to the Iron Age. On your screen, you will find the African map. What you see is the map of Africa. Among the various continents in the world, Africa is known to be the second largest continent after Asia. This means that the only continent in the world that is bigger than Africa is Asia. In spite of Africa being the second largest continent in the world, its population, when it is calculated in terms of the world's population, is just 10% of the world's population. Because of this, one can say that Africa is a continent that is underpopulated, because the size of the continent does not match with the number of people living in it. This is given to the reason that in Africa, you find one of the world's largest desert areas, that is the Sahara Desert, located right in Africa. This implies that there is a very large land area in Africa which is uninhabitable, where you find that there are no people living in that area. This is because the conditions of the desert area does not make the place suitable to be inhabited by human beings, even animals and even plants. Because of this, even though Africa is the second largest continent in the world, it makes up only 10% of the world's population. If you want to look at the land area of Africa in terms of its square kilometers, the size of Africa is 30.3 million square kilometers. If you want to calculate this size in terms of countries, you can say that the size of Africa is equal to a combination of the size of the United States of America, Argentina, Europe, India, China, and New Zealand. That is, when you put the sizes of all these countries together, then you can find the size of Africa. From the east to the west, the distance of Africa is about 7,200 kilometers wide. And then when you look at the length, that is from the north to the south, you find a distance of 8,000 kilometers. The equator divides Africa virtually into two parts, or into two halves. So we have the northern Africa and then the South Africa, or the southern parts of Africa. The southern part of Africa is what is referred to as the sub-Saharan Africa. The northern part of Africa was invaded by the Arabs. Because of this, you find most of the countries in this area to be practitioners or believers of the Islam faith. And when you come to the southern part of Africa, it is the part which was also invaded by the Europeans and the British. And so you find most of their population to be Christians. Most of the people living in North Africa are fair-skinned. That is, they are fair in complexion. And then you have people living in the southern Africa or sub-Saharan Africa as the dark-skinned or dark in complexion. Because of this, it is incorrect to define an African by the color of his or her skin, because you find both fair and dark complexion people living in the continent of Africa. As at February 2022, the population of Africa is 1,392,060,706. Africa consists of 54 countries, including islands on its coast and then countries on its land areas. Madagascar, which is one of the biggest islands in the world, is located in Africa. You find other islands like the Seychelles and Comoros, Sao Tome. They all make up the 54 countries in Africa. When you come to Africa, you find that most of the states or the countries are multilingual. This means that the African people speak several different languages. This implies that you cannot pinpoint one particular language and ascribe it to the African people. You cannot say that in Africa they speak this language, like you say about the United Kingdom. Unless you want to divide Africa into Anglophone or Francophone countries, then you can say that this part of Africa has an official language, which is French, or an official language, which is English. But traditionally, the African states, or Africa as a continent, is a multilingual continent. In Nigeria alone, for instance, you find more than or around 500 languages. When you come to Kenya, there is about 100 or even more different languages that are spoken in that country alone. Ghana also has over more than 40 languages that are spoken in the country. I would want to emphasize that Africa is a continent and not a country. It is a continent with 54 different countries. Africa is known to be one of the world's resourced continents. And in terms of resources, the greater part of Africans' resources are natural resources. And so when you come to Africa, you find minerals like gold, bauxite, manganese, fossil fuel. There are large vegetations of grasslands, wildlife like the elephants, giraffe, the hippopotamus, the lion. We have large river bodies, mountains, timber, and a whole lot. Africa is indeed a very well-resourced continent, and its resources are largely natural. Let's go back to the map of Africa. Africa has 4 boundaries, and to the north, it shares boundaries with Europe and the Mediterranean Sea. To the west is the Atlantic Ocean. The eastern part of Africa shares boundaries with the Saudi Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. To the south is a mixture of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. If you look at the 4 boundaries of Africa, one can say that Africa shares boundaries largely with the ocean. Most of Africa's boundaries are the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. Let's look at the history of Africa. Unlike Asia and Europe and other continents, Africa as a continent originally lacked written record of its history. Some early Europeans and non-Africans were of the view that Africa did not have a history. For several years, what the African knew about him or herself and what non-Africans knew about the African continent and the African people were reports from early European explorers and missionaries who visited the continent of Africa. But through the use of modern methods, formal education, now some Africans and even some Europeans, through archaeological findings, anthropology, and linguistics or studies in linguistics, are able or have been able to recount and reconstruct the history of the continent of Africa and the African people. Because of this, one can say that there is a history of Africa and a history of the African people. This reconstruction by the African scholars or modern scholars indicates that Africa as a continent has had a history full of scientific innovation. its history had contact with several other cultures. And these other cultures have had immense influence on the cultures of Africa. Because of this, one can say that the history and the culture of the African people has evolved and developed over the years. It has not remained static, but has changed as periods or times also changed, and as Africa got into contact with other cultures. Let's look at prehistory to the Iron Age. In human history, some studies have given 3 time periods in human history: the Bronze Age, the Stone Age, and the Iron Age. The Stone Age is seen as the period in human history where human beings or where humans made tools or weapons from stones or by the use of stones. Several years later, the metal known as bronze was discovered. So humans began to use bronze in the manufacturing of tools and weapons in their daily activities. And this period is referred to as the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age was the discovery of iron. And this marks the period of the Iron Age. So the Iron Age is seen as the period in human history where human beings used iron in the manufacturing of tools and other weapons, which helped in their daily activities. In Africa, or before the Iron Age, archaeological findings have revealed that Africa is the first place to be habited or to be inhabited by human beings. Research shows that it was the first place human beings lived before they migrated to other parts or they moved to other parts of the world about 4 million years ago. The first modern man, research has shown, is said to have appeared on the continent of Africa about 250,000 years ago. The Iron Age is known to be the prehistoric period where weapons and tools were made or produced from iron. This period in human history is said to have started between 1200 BC and 600 BC. But in Africa, the Iron Age is traditionally marked to be between or to be around 200 and 1000 BCE. The question then is, what kind of life was the African living before the Iron Age, before the introduction of iron to Africa? What kind of life was the African living? Depending on which part or region of Africa a person lived, early Africans are known to have lived as pastoralists, gatherers, fishermen, or hunters. So their main economic activities were pastoralism, gathering, hunting, and then fishing. The gatherers were a group of people who collected food from the forest, and that served as their sources of, or that served as their food. The gatherers were not people cultivating food or growing their food on their own. Rather, they go into the forest, gather what they find, and then they feed on it. Because of this, they did not have a permanent place of residence. As and when the place they were staying gets exhausted with the food or could not provide for them the food they needed anymore, they moved to find a new place and they continued to search for food. The pastoralists were also people engaged in the rearing of animals, especially cattle. Just like the gatherers, the pastoralists also did not have a stable place of residence. Rather, they moved from one place to the other in search of grass for their animals to graze and in search of food to feed themselves. The pastoralists had as their main source of food meat and then milk, but they supplemented it with wild grains and fruits they found in the forest as they moved from one place to the other. The hunters went into the farm or into the bush, the forest, hunted for animals, and then used it as their main source of feed, their main source of food. The same with the fishermen. So, with the pastoralist, as and when the grass they found at a particular place gets exhausted or gets dried up due to changes in the weather condition, they moved. This implied that they covered a large area of the African continent. Over the next 2,000 years, because the pastoralists were moving from place to place, their economic activity of herding or rearing of animals has spread to the central Sahara Desert, made its way all the way to the Atlantic coast, into the highlands of present-day Ethiopia, and south to the border of Africa's tropical forest. The central Sahara Desert is known to have been a very fertile area for the grazing of animals. You may begin to wonder, looking at the present state of the Sahara region, which is now a desert area, you may begin to wonder how the pastoralists were surviving in that area. Research shows that several million years ago, the Sahara region was a very fertile area with large grasslands and vegetation and regular supply of water. This means that several years ago, when you went into the Sahara region, it was a place full of trees and grasses that was suitable for human habitation. However, changes in the weather condition or changes in the climate had caused the Sahara Desert or the Sahara area to lose all of its vegetation and turned it into a desert area. The Sahara Desert is known or referred to as a waste resource or a waste area because it is a very huge land area, but it cannot be used productively. I have earlier indicated that the Sahara area was a very rich area or had a very rich vegetation, but due to changes in the climate, which lasted for about 4,500 years, the Sahara region has now become a desert. But during this long period of change, due to the movement of the pastoralists and the gatherers coming towards this area, new and various settlements emerged in this area. So you found the gatherers, you found the pastoralists, you found hunters and fishermen emerging or developing at the Sahara area. This gave birth to new societies and new communities. One or scholars were thinking that because the Sahara area consisted of gatherers and pastoralists and fishermen and hunters, they would have borrowed from each other to the extent that there were a mixture of activities. But research shows that even though the people had adopted some new behaviors from each other, there was evidence to show that the people largely specialized in their own traditional economic activities. This means that the pastoralists were still practicing the rearing of animals. The gatherers were still going into the forest to gather their food to feed themselves. Same with the fishermen and the hunters. However, they adapted new ways of living or borrowed behaviors from each other. As the climate continued to change in the Sahara area and the area began to get dry, it could not provide for the new settlers what they needed to survive on. The grasses were drying up, so the pastoralists could not get enough grasses for their animals to graze or for their animals to feed. The place was drying up, so when the gatherers go into the forest, they were not getting enough food to feed themselves and their families. Same with the fishermen and the hunters. They were not getting enough game or enough fishes to live on. So they began to adapt to new ways of living. They began to experiment with their environment. So from that experimentation, they began to grow food to feed or to supplement their traditional or original food. What this means is that as time went on, the people living in the Sahara Desert came to know about what? Agriculture. As they came to adopt new ways of living, there is not much evidence to show that the pastoralists and the gatherers began to cultivate or began to cultivate their own food. But there is evidence to show that as they moved from the Sahara region into the Savannah region and they had contact with people living in West Africa, they adopted the practice of cultivating their own food. The West Africans also had as their economic activity agriculture. So when the people who migrated from the Savannah region, who migrated from the Sahara area, came into contact with the people living in the Savannah region, they developed the act of farming or agriculture. So they began to grow crops like, or to grow grains like wheat, millet, sorghum, and rice to supplement their food. But the weather condition did not get better. It continued to change and it continued to dry things up. And this even affected the source of water or the sources of water for the people. This meant that at a particular point in time, there was scarcity of water, where both human beings and animals had to live on the same source or sources of water. And because it was nearly impossible for animals and the human beings to live on the same sources of water, a new activity emerged. Indeed, human beings and animals could not survive on the same sources of water because the animals were prone to contamination, or because the animals could contaminate the water. Whenever animals go into a river source to drink water, there was the likelihood that they would step into the water and get it muddy. They could even ease themselves into the water. They could infect and contaminate the water which would have had a bad impact on the lives of the humans. So human beings, or the early Africans, devised a strategy. And this strategy was to keep the animals at home, not necessarily their places of residence, but but also at places where humans or the early Africans devised a new strategy. And this strategy was to keep the animals at home. And this gave rise to the domestication of animals in Africa. So here, the pastoralist would keep the animals in a pen or find a land area where they can keep them. So they will go into the bush, get the grasses the animals need to feed on, and then bring in water for the animals. And this was done to protect the water sources that the early Africans were living on. As the practice of keeping the animals at home continued, animals became domesticated in Africa. So when you want to talk about the origin of domestication in Africa, one can say that the scarcity of water sources in Africa compelled the early Africans to keep the animals at home and rather provide for them their food and their sources of water. There is evidence to show that some early Africans deliberately took the animals into land areas that did not provide them with the food and the water they needed to survive on their own. Because of that, the animals stayed at one particular area. What they survived on was what their masters or what the herders brought to them as food and water. This practice continued until date. We continue to domesticate animals in our various or respective countries or societies. Let's look at the introduction and spread of metal technology in Africa. After or around the year 1000 BC, research shows or indicates that the Greeks and the Carthaginians brought iron and copper technology to North Africa, and from there it spread southwards all the way to the Nile Valley. This means that iron technology came to Africa through the Greeks and the Carthaginians. But other scholars or other studies indicate that even before the Carthaginians and the Greeks brought iron to Africa, around the same time, that is around the same 1000 BC, where the Greeks and the Carthaginians brought or introduced iron to Africa, the people in the sub-Sahara Africa region were already working with metals at that same time. Again, around the year 2000 BC, there is evidence to show that people in Egypt and then the Nubians were also smelting bronze. This put together suggests that before the Greeks and the Carthaginians introduced iron to the African people, Africans already had knowledge about metal technology. However, this knowledge was not widespread, but was limited to the societies where they were practiced. The introduction of iron by the Greeks and the Carthaginians rather gave a widespread nature to metal technology in Africa. If you look at East Africa, research has not been able to give a definite time period or date where the smelting of iron began. Nonetheless, some scholars suggest that the Bantu people who are located in East Africa were working with iron somewhere around 1000 BC. Some scholars even claim that the Bantus working with iron, or some scholars even claim that the Bantus were working with iron even earlier before 1000 BC. They are known, or the Bantus are known to be the first people to produce iron in sub-Saharan Africa. But the use of iron technology did not change their society or the way the Bantus lived their lives. So when the African came to know about metal technology, or came to know about iron, research shows that it had an impact on their lives. One of them is that before iron technology, the African, either as a pastoralist, undertook its activities with sticks or bones or animal bones. The farmers undertook their farming activities or by clearing land areas with animal bones or sticks or weapons or tools they produced from stones or other resources in their natural environment. And so when iron was introduced, the African could now smelt the iron and produce farm implements like cutlasses and hoes. This helped them to be able to clear large areas of land much easier and faster for their farming activities. So the introduction of iron contributed to the production of farming tools, which aided in the agricultural activities of early Africans. Again, it allowed the early Africans to move into new areas, clear them, and make their own settlement. So people living in a particular area could find a new place, move and settle there. Because of that, the settlement or the land area of the African people was increasing. People were now not living in clusters. Rather, they could move into even far places to settle. And this collectively expanded the settlements of the early Africans. So new areas or new settlements were developing or were emerging. And this led to an increase in the population of Africa. It also provided employment for the artisans, the blacksmiths, and the artisans who were working with stones, and the blacksmiths could now smelt the iron and produce tools and weapons and implements for people. People were paying them for the production of these artworks. People were also paying them for the production of the tools. At that particular moment in time, because iron or metal technology was new in Africa, the people who were into its production, the blacksmiths, the artisans, became very important people in society. It gave them money, it gave them power, and then it gave them authority. It also allowed the early Africans to produce weapons from iron. They could now produce guns and spears and bow and arrow, which they could use to protect their territories and to defend themselves. Furthermore, you can talk about the production of ornaments and artworks. So the impact of the introduction of iron was that it allowed the early Africans to make beautiful ornaments and artworks to adorn themselves and portray their culture as well. Lastly, it enhanced the regional trade within the Savannah region and the Sub-Sahara region. People could now trade in metals. People could now trade in the farm tools in distant places. So people in Sub-Sahara Africa would buy the tools or farming implements or the metal tools from the artisans, travel to distant land areas to sell them to other places, to sell them to other people in other places. It also increased the wealth of the traders engaged in the trading of metal tools, which had a rippling effect on their communities. These trading activities led to the development of cities in Sub-Sahara Africa. This is where we bring the class to a close. So what have we been saying all this while? In summary, we have gotten introduced to the continent of Africa. We have said that it is the second largest continent in Africa, contains 54 countries, largely shares boundaries with the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and have the people to be multilingual. There is not much evidence about how the early Africans lived their lives in the Bronze and the Stone Age. Some scholars even suggest that Africa does not have a Bronze or a Stone Age. But there is record to show at a point in time, iron was introduced to the African, and then we have the Iron Age. We have also discussed how the introduction of iron impacted the life of the African. This is where we bring our class to a close. I hope to see you next week for the next lecture. Thank you.